Into the Spiderverse is one of my favorite films in recent memory. Apart from its well-crafted story and fresh take on Spider-Man as a hero, it's also instantly recognizable due to its unique art style. In my opinion, it blends 2D and 3D so well and really captures what a moving comic book movie would feel like. In this video, I'm going to be examining its art and how it uses its style to convey emotion. I'm coming at this from the point of view of an illustrator, so we're going to be breaking down the visual DNA behind the movie and analyzing lots of concept art, as well as some personal work from the artists where the style is also used. Before we begin, I would also like to give a quick shout out to my friend John, who gave me tons of ideas for this topic, so thank you so much, and let's go ahead and get started. When we have a look at the art of Into the Spider-Verse, it's immediately clear that it's not going for realism. There's big blocky shapes everywhere, there's lots of visual stylization, but these images still feel realistic to us. I've heard one of the art directors for the film, Patrick O'Keefe, refer to this style as graphic reduction in his own personal work. So, for the purposes of this video, that's what we're going to call it as well. I describe the style as complex simplicity, because at first glance, there's an incredible amount of detail, from the props to the way the materials are rendered and even how the lights are all set up. But the reason why I love this art style so much is when we closely examine any one object, it's actually quite simple. And this isn't to suggest that this is lazy or easy. In fact, I'd almost argue the opposite. It's a collection of shapes expressed so clearly. Graphic reduction is all about distilling the complexities of the world around us into their core idea. Why use many words when few words do trick? I mean, I'm half joking here, right? But there's much to be said about what you choose to remove in your art as there is for what to include. It's precision and deliberation. I believe that there are three main pillars that make graphic reduction so appealing, and they are shape, value and color, and texture. Okay, so in this example, we can see this portrayal of Manhattan here as shown in Spiderverse, and this is really where we can start delving into some shape design stuff. So off the bat, we can see these buildings here in the background are absolutely massive. These are huge. So this scene feels immense and powerful to us, right? But if we have a look over here, this is the Empire State Building. And just having a really quick search on Google, we can see that the height of the Empire State Building is 443 meters. So that is pretty big, right? But if we compare it to these ones in the distance, this is like some Judge Dredd level type buildings. These are absolutely huge. And, greatly exaggerated, of course, but when you consider the context of what's happening in the film, everything kind of makes sense. So it was an intentional choice to make Manhattan feel cold and somewhat alien to Miles Morales, because this whole place here represents somewhere outside of his comfort zone. You'll notice in the start of the film, a lot of the scenes set in Brooklyn are a lot more warmer because that's his home, that's where he comes from. And by exaggerating these buildings here as being like 800 stories tall, us as the audience, we're viewing Manhattan through Miles's perspective, and we're sort of positioned to feel the same way. I mean, this is how a kid would really look at the city and just be completely overwhelmed by all of these structures over here. And just continuing on from that, in this example, we can see some interior of a few of the buildings in the skyline. Once we get into it though, we can see how abstract all of these tiny shapes are here. So we get, hints of a boardroom or like little hints of offices here. Maybe this is some kind of break room or a kitchen here, but none of these details are really that rendered. And why is that? Well, they don't really need to be. And instead it's flat shapes. And one thing that I want you guys to remember is just the concept of big, medium, and small. So once we start breaking the shapes down, we can see we have a big shape here for this building. And then we have, going a little bit smaller, I would consider these like, small, medium shapes. And then within that, we have all these tiny little bits and pieces that look like chairs, that look like lights. They also look like little bits of visual noise, maybe like a poster frame here or something like that. But by breaking this down in this way, we're not going to get overwhelmed by all of these details. Simply just focus on the hierarchy of shapes. Number one, big building. Number two, the windows. And number three, all the small stuff within there. Big, medium, and small. And if you're also curious about how you might approach painting a building like this, I made a tutorial where you can check it out right here. Okay, so just continuing on from shape design, let's use this example here and break it down even more. This is another piece of concept art, but this one, I believe the framing and staging actually makes it directly into the film. And before I get into it, I think it's important to address the purposes of some of these artworks, because on a big film like this, each piece of art that's done in pre-production serve many different needs. So some of them are used to concept the locations, others are explorations into style, and ones like this are known as sequence illustrations. So they act to showcase some kind of emotional story beat, and I think that there can actually be a lot learned from analyzing them. So the context for this scene is that the Spider-Man in Miles' world has just died. You know, the world is in mourning, and Miles himself is really unsure about his future and if he can even be a worthy successor. So the shape language in this piece I find really interesting because, first things first, it uses a lot of leading lines to kind of guide our eyes towards the middle of the frame here. And even these lines at the top, they kind of guide you towards the TV screen, which is something that Miles is looking at. So subtly, even just, the ones on these shelves, they kind of point down this way. You can see that these gold bands are kind of following this direction here as well. And even this bit of carpet on the floor, or some kind of reflective material, it's all leading us to look at Miles right here. So Miles is also much, much smaller than the rest of the characters in the scene, and he's sort of sandwiched between these two people here. And there's nothing necessarily special about how he's framed, and that's kind of the point. So our hero is made to feel small here, almost blending in with these other New York citizens, and is just sort of quietly contemplating and processing what has just happened. But apart from the storytelling side of things, just have a look at all of this juicy shape language over here. Like there's just so much in this frame. I would probably say that all of these costumes here are treated as one shape. The same thing for this guy right here, especially all of these ones over here. And once again, they all kind of funnel us towards our main hero. But just remember what I said earlier about big, medium, small. So we have these major shapes that kind of separate the store out from each other. So like this part here, which is where all the costumes are, is separated from the actual shop floor itself. And then once we break it down, we have tons of smaller shapes as well. So within that, we've got these coat hangers. We've got all these little bits and pieces of fabric here. We've got this space helmet. Again, big, medium, small. Something I really like about this graphic reduction style is all of these edges are really, really sharp and crisp. And I would go ahead and assume that a lot of this was created intentionally, and by using something like the lasso tool with 100% opacity. There's not a lot of blurry edges, and Into the Spider-Verse uses many creative ways to get around that. In the film, chromatic aberration and smearing are used in quick succession instead of a traditional motion blur, and this is even used to create a depth of field. So this sticks mainly within the style by having and maintaining these strong shapes, and they pull from this visual language they've crafted, which is really, really awesome. So one last thing is that we can also see there's really great use of negative shapes within this scene here. We can really see our characters pop out from this light background that they've got. This technique here is something that's used multiple times in a lot of the concept art I've seen for Spider-Verse, and it's one of the simplest ways to engage the viewer, and that's just by placing contrast on these points of interest. And for me, I believe that one of the strongest elements of graphic reduction has to be how the values are controlled. So this is a piece of concept art done by Eugenio, and at first glance, it looks real. If I was looking at this for a second, I might think it's a photograph, but once again, on closer inspection, that's when we can see that a lot of these objects are rendered quite simply. The power lies within the values and their relationship with each other. So as long as the values hold up and make sense, you can get away with things like skewing some of the perspective, or sneaking in tiny blocks of color and this more abstract brushwork that's so common in Spider-Verse concept art. Here's a good example by Patrick O'Keefe. This is actually a personal piece that he's done, but we can appreciate how all of these values are laid out. For me, when I look at this, my eye goes directly here to this middle bowl with the lemons, but watch what happens when I convert this to black and white. It's the same value as this one down here. So what Patrick has done is that he's intentionally placed the most amount of color contrast right here. Because the values read strongly, it still works. So maybe this color splash here is what drew Patrick O'Keefe to the scene. Maybe he wanted to give some extra jazz to it because there's some lemons in here and it could be like a focal point. We're not really sure, but because the values hold up so well, things can really get expressed through the color choices. You know what I mean? Like, there's so much subtlety here. And that's only possible because of all of these accurate values. Like, have a look at this napkin here. We've got a bit of green, a bit of yellow, some purple, and again, if we go back and convert it, it all makes sense. If I go back and switch, we can see how these little color choices can sneak through. Here is a gorgeous piece by Alberto Mielgo, and you know, I think this one's a great example because it not only illustrates how values can be used to portray a realistic looking scene, but actually enhance it. So, you know, this is a moody night scene that's punctuated from the glow here by all of the screens in Times Square, and we're getting a lot of this like nice light spill that's coming around the sides. The buildings that are running parallel to the light source, like these ones up here, we can see the reflections within them as the light sort of, you know, bouncing around, passing it, and then coming back down to where we are. But the buildings that are perpendicular to it are completely dark. If we go ahead and squint and just have a look at this illustration, we can really see how all of the values are distributed. There's this upside down T shape here, and by having the ground be wet and slick, we get to reflect and bounce around all of the lights in this scene. I do want to go ahead and stress that the relationships here are important. You know, the objects in the scene that are giving off light are by far the brightest on the value scale, and then everything sort of falls beneath that. You know, the bus, for instance here, is white, and it reads to us as being white, but if we color pick it, and then just go into the middle, like look how dark that is. So this is actually just something that's known as color constancy, which is our brains tricking us into seeing local colors as unchanging. So basically, we just see and believe this bus is white, even though it's still nighttime. And again, it has to do with the relationships of values within each other. Like this is lighter than this, but this overall is darker than these lights over here. So that's the magic of creating believable scenes like this. Even though the colors might be the first things that we notice, the values are doing so much of the work underneath the hood. All right, and finally, I believe that the last core fundamental of what makes graphic production so appealing is the use of texture. So in this concept art piece of Peter B. Parker's apartment, which is also done by Patrick O'Keefe, just pay attention to how many different textures and materials are on display here. You know, we have diffuse wood flooring over here. We've got a bunch of old bricks. We also have reflections here in these poster frames. We also have the mirror here. We've got also specularity on all of the different reflective objects within the scene. And all of this tied together with strong shape design, with good values, is what really sells it to me. You know, Spiderverse does a really great job of making all of these objects feel like what they're representative of, but also have a look at all of the grit and grime that's present within them. You know, it's painted with all of these different textured brushes. You know, we've got rake brushes, we've got different brick brushes that are used. I believe that all of these small imperfections add so much character and depth to the props. So this one here is a personal piece from Rob Ripple, and I think it's a great example for how he uses texture to enrich his artwork. This one is also taken from his book called Graphic LA, which I really highly recommend if you want to learn more about this graphic reduction style. And you know, the first thing when I look at this image that's pretty obvious to me is just how the shadow of the road separates into the light. You know, like we can see if I just zoom in here, there's a movement in these brushstrokes. They're all traveling this direction, which also happens to be the direction that our cyclist is headed towards. And you know, even in the background here, like this building, like have a look at this stuff. All of this stuff here, this is awesome. We have all tiny bits and subtle little textures here that make up this building, and it adds all of this character and makes it feel a lot older. However, for me, what I think is the most interesting part about this painting is this background street corner over here. Like right at the bottom, right down at this street here, it's literally all just cubes and noise, right? And if we just zoom in, like look at all of these small textures here. You know, some stuff's bleeding into each other. There's little cubes, there's shapes that's been broken up, there's bands going across, all of this kind of stuff. And, you know, right up to here, it doesn't look like much to us. In fact, it looks like an abstract painting. But this really helps to nail down the core of graphic reduction. Now from this distance here, all of these tiny small shapes help us feel like there's depth, an entire street down there. But all of this is aggregate perspective, you know? Everything's kind of following the same rhythm and the same lines in space. So we don't really need to detail every single thing here because it's not necessary to support the main point of this artwork, which I would argue is this guy right over here. You know, and if we just take a look at a regular street scene, and this is just one taken from Google Maps, think about how you would approach simplifying all of these tiny shapes here. You know, try to abstract them and then group them where it makes sense and get to the point where it conveys your idea, but stop rendering there. You don't need to add a lot of details. We can even see that if we zoom out all the way here, these are just tiny, tiny, tiny small shapes, and we can find ways of conveying that. So even though in Spiderverse, you know, there's big, clean shapes with sharp edges, there still exists so much texture within them that it really helps to separate all of the different objects together. So really pay attention to the materials around you and how they catch and reflect light. So now I'd like to do a small demo that encompasses some of the things I was talking about. And I'm doing this really basic study of a shoe that I found in a store, but I found this yellow bounce light really interesting and I wanted to capture that. So before I even begin talking about certain techniques and all that stuff, I want to touch upon creating things from our artistic lens. So the thing that makes all of these previous artwork special, you know, it's not just the subject matter, but the very intentional and deliberate way that the artists have chosen to present it to us. So, you know, these days cameras and reference photos capture absolutely everything, but the cool thing that we can do is ignore the details that aren't important to us. The way that we filter visual information and what we choose to include in our pieces makes a strong statement about us as artists. There's this really awesome video about Disney artists painting a tree, which I'll link in the description, but it shows how each artist brings a different focus and style to that work. Now, in the video, they all go out and paint a tree, and some of them choose to try and recreate the intricate details of the bark. You know, others might try and push the entire design of the tree as a whole. So I'd really be recommending you to always be thinking about your truth and trying as best as you can to capture how you see something, not just what you see. You know, a couple of questions I like to ask myself as I'm doing studies like this is, what is your emotional experience of the subject? Is there anything you want to enhance? Is there anything that you want to reduce? And by considering these different factors, it's what makes art so special, is when you can really feel that in an illustration. So for the study, I started off with some basic line art to get the overall shapes and perspective, and then I moved on to filling the color. I'm constantly referring to my reference and thinking about how I can push or pull certain elements. You know, like really making an effort to make the metal of the shoelace holes here feel correct, and having that contrast with the rubber of the soles, or the highlights on top of the leather or whatever it is. You know, you don't need to capture every tiny detail to tell the story. Just keep focusing on what's important to you and reduce the complexities into simple shapes and colors. And for the techniques, I'm using a lot of the lasso tool to create the main shapes of the shoe. And just like we mentioned before, using a lot of textured brushes just to bring out some of the extra details and grit and just to stylize it a little bit more. There's also a couple of different color choices that I've added to really enhance things the way I see it. And yeah, I would recommend you guys to do this as well. So that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you found it helpful, I would also highly recommend these videos too by Mania Kra. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And also Howard Wimshurst. They've both done fantastic breakdowns of the art of Into the Spider-Verse as well. If you found this breakdown helpful, feel free to leave a comment and give it a like. Let me know if you have any questions, and you can also find more of my work on Instagram at DanielAngArt. Now, go forward, think about how you would simplify the world around you, and as always, have fun. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.